Hi, my name is Dr. Josephine Lukita. I am an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the School of Journalism and Media, and I'm super thrilled to be here talking about global mis and disinformation in the Truth and Trust Online conference. I was born and raised in New York City, and then I went to school in upstate New York in this tiny liberal arts college called SUNY Geneseo. And at the time I wanted to be a journalist, but I realized when I was an undergrad I liked doing a lot more research about journalism than actually being a journalist. So I kind of pivoted to doing more research on journalism. That's kind of how I found myself in grad school. I went to Syracuse for my master's and then ultimately Wisconsin for my PhD. A lot of what I study is very kind of about cross-platform dynamics. So what I think about is how does social media content end up in news content, spreading misinformation in unintended ways. So a lot of my early work as a PhD student was looking at Russian trolls that would accidentally end up in news media stories because of tweets that they had posted online. And then we would find that if they're quoted in a news story, they actually get more followers, right? Because you embed a Russian troll tweet into a news story, people click that tweet, will follow the user, and so there is this kind of dangerous relationship where journalists were accidentally quoting Russian trolls, thinking they were American citizens, and then Russian trolls would benefit by getting followers because they were quoted in a mainstream news organization. They were primarily part of this group called the Internet Research Agency, and so the Internet Research Agency runs what are called sock puppet accounts, right? And so these are real people pretending to be American citizens across the political spectrum. So we had some Russian trolls that pretended to be conservatives, some Russian trolls who pretended to be Black Lives Matter activists, and they would be really active across a range of social media platforms. So they had live journal blog groups, they had Twitter accounts, of course, they were on Tumblr, they were making Facebook events that real Americans were actually attending, which is kind of scary when you think about it. And then of course they were ending up in news stories. A lot of the work that I was looking at specifically with news stories and Russian trolls being quoted in news stories ended up being cited in the Mueller report specifically because of the mechanism in which that happened. And so a lot of the news stories were quoting Russian trolls because they thought they were genuine Americans. And in journalism, there's this concept called vox populi, or voice of the people. So the typical way we've done vox populi is by quoting people on a man on the street interview. So a news story happens, a journalist goes out and interviews someone literally on the street. But now we don't actually have to do that, right? We don't have to lug around our equipment. Instead, we go on Twitter, we find a hot take, we throw it into a news story, and we end up with these news stories where there's maybe one or two newsworthy sentences and a string of 20 or 30 tweets, basically, or social media posts. And we're seeing this happen a lot, just as an increasing trend in journalism, and this is how Russian trolls or disinformation actors or misinformation actors end up getting embedded into news stories. When I go to newsrooms and when I talk to folks, I actually try to encourage better habits about when you are quoting a Twitter account, you might want to DM them and check that they're a real person, right? Or you might want to ask for their contact information, or you might want to let them know that their tweet is going to be embedded in your news story, because a person on Twitter, even if they're a real person, might not want their tweet to be elevated in a news story that way, right? They might not want that many followers and that sort of thing.
Why are events like Truth and Trust Online in person? Why are these events important?
Yeah, oh man, these events are, I think in general, they're really, really important for bringing together researchers and people who care about the issue of misinformation and disinformation. And I think as a society, we know that the quality of information, the increasing amount of poor information is causing harm in a lot of different ways, whether it's spreading COVID misinformation or political misinformation that causes a lot of animosity. We know these are problematic, but there's a lot of different people working in this space, right? Whether you're in academia and you're a computer scientist or a social scientist such as myself, or whether you're outside of academia, whether you're an NGO or a citizen researcher or a journalist. And if we didn't have events like this, we wouldn't be able to get together and share our knowledge and talk to each other about what we learned. And I think having it in person is just so important, right? I think as we kind of move in this digital ecosystem, we're realizing that the way forward is hybrid conferences that allow the opportunity, if you cannot or do not want to travel, you can still participate, and opportunities where if you wanted to be here and engage in that way, there's a mechanism to do so. A lot of the early work that I had been doing was very focused on Russian trolls in the US, and increasingly, at least in the United States, what we're finding is that a lot of the misinformation is no longer being spread by external actors, external state actors, but happening within our own citizenry, right? And so there's a lot of misinformation spread from citizens to citizens. And so a lot of my research in the US has moved in that direction, starting to look at alt-right communities and the spread of misinformation among people who have a lot of distrust in institutions. And sometimes that distrust is very rightfully placed, right? Governments are not perfect, journalistic institutions are not perfect, but that also doesn't mean we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And there's a lot of importance, I think, in thinking through why people believe in this sort of misinformation. Outside of the US, a lot of my attention has turned towards the role of power in spreading misinformation and disinformation. As I was doing my Russian troll research, I realized obviously the US is not the first place Russia tried to spread misinformation. Way before the US, they were trying to spread misinformation in their own home country, and that's how Russia ended up developing a lot of these disinformation tactics, was because they were testing them on their own citizens, and citizens in Ukraine and Belarus and those within their sphere of influence. And so I started looking at more state power and state disinformation targeting domestic citizens in their own home country. Pardon? Yeah. Yes. And so Russia in particular they've learned so much from the Stalin era, from the Cold War, on producing misinformation, not just to spread incorrect information, but to sow division and make people so upset they no longer want to engage in politics. And we've noticed that these strategies Russia has developed over decades, other countries are also taking on now. And so a lot of the strategies we originally saw in Russia, we also see in Iran as well as in China, both targeting domestic audiences as well as foreign audiences. I think what gives me the most optimism is coming to conferences like this and knowing that there are other people who are really motivated to try to solve these problems. Another area that I don't know if it's optimism, but something that I try to remind myself about is that these are not new issues, right? This question of disinformation and misinformation, I think, has been heightened because of the digital media ecosystem and because of what's happening now. But we've had disinformation and misinformation for centuries, right? For as long as society has existed, we've had issues with yellow journalism and sensationalism and misinformation from state powers. And so I think reminding myself that this is a really pivotal point in time because people care about this issue and people want to solve it in this current media ecosystem, that's a reminder that, there's more of us working on this than there have been in the past. It's not just institutions like journalistic news organizations that are doing this. Anyone can go online and be a misinformation or disinformation spreader, right? And so my hope is that as long as there are enough citizens that care about finding truths, that care about one another, that will kind of overcome those who are more motivated to engage in misinformation practices.
I admire your optimism. I hope you're right.
I don't know if I'm always going to be right, but I feel like when I talk to other people who are motivated to answer these, or especially when I talk to students in my classroom, they're always trying to find tools or things that they can do to find better quality information or talk to their parents about misinformation they might hear from their family members. And sometimes it's really unfortunate because I know these sort of issues stress my students out, but the hope that I get is that they actually want to solve these things, right? Like I very rarely go into a classroom and have someone kind of spew misinformation my way. Most of them are trying to improve on their information ecosystem. So I do come from kind of a more critical cultural background. A lot of the theory that I work on is kind of sociology-based theory. I think a lot about how groups communicate with one another in a public sphere when they try to engage in political actions and things like that. Sometimes I will kind of dip into a little bit more philosophy, especially if it's kind of philosophy of language, especially. And so the reason why I do a lot of computational natural language processing work is because a lot of my background is in sociolinguistics and semiotics and trying to understand how people use words to make sense of things or to understand things about their world.
How many languages do you speak?
I speak one fluently, and that is English, unfortunately. I conversationally also speak Bahasa Indonesia, which is the Indonesian language. I know a little bit of French as well. And then I just am a great admirer of other languages. Oh my gosh, when I was a graduate student, one of the things I really wanted to learn was Quenya, which is the constructed language that J.R.R. Tolkien made that's Elvish. He actually created 3 Elvish languages, and Quenya happens to be one of them. And as a graduate student, I was like, I totally want to learn this and figure out how the grammar works. I didn't quite get there, but in general, I find that sort of stuff really interesting. And I think most people who do philosophy of language stuff tend to be much more critical, or they know that we're never going to fully understand language in some ways. This is actually one area that gives me a little bit of comfort, because people always ask me, like, is there a point where we'll have a computer that understands everything humans say? And the reality is probably not, because humans are constructing and creating language and using it in really, really weird ways that a computer, frankly, will never be able to predict. One thing that natural language processing has always struggled with is sarcasm, right? Trying to detect sarcasm. And it's partly because humans also suck at detecting sarcasm, right? We as humans are not even very good at it. And the other reason is because it's complicated. It requires a lot of context and knowledge about different things. That because a lot of sarcasm is typically expressed phonologically, which means through audio. So you can tell when I'm being sarcastic because I'm like, oh, that's great. So you can tell tonally, but you lose a little bit of that when you write it in like internet speak. So what people have actually found is that internet users have different techniques for showing that they're being sarcastic. One way is using what's called SpongeBob capitalization. So when you have uppercase and lowercase letters, generally you're saying it in this sort of mocking way, right, in a sarcastic way. Another way that this linguist, her name is Gretchen McCullough, studied is called sparkle sarcasm, when you put kind of tildes and asterisks in between or around words to indicate that you're like being sarcastic, right? And so people have found really interesting written ways to illustrate what they mean when they don't have the tonal expressions for it.
I guess quotation marks.
Quotation marks, or a /s is another way, right? /sarcasm. Another thing that computers, emojis are excellent for that. Another area where NLP is not great at is also like understanding meme culture, right? And I think in general, memes are a really fascinating thing about humans, and memes emerge in really, really different, weird ways that are hard, oftentimes, for a computer to capture.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that is really important for me to always express is that there is room for people who are interested in this stuff, right? And oftentimes I'm working with students or young folks who are like, well, how do I get into it? And frankly, the way to get into it is to attend a conference like this, right? Is to attend TTO and meet other people and be engaged in the conversation. And I think there's always a space for new people who are interested in that to join us.